Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest episode of Between the Pages with the Sound on Stage. I'm Greg Heilman, and this is our third episode, and the first one without author Alan Harrison. Our focus on Between the Pages is twofold. Yes, authors who focus on the performing arts, but also playwrights. And this week we have Beau Prichard, who is part of that latter category, and he's here to talk about a piece he's been working on, I think, since the pandemic, or maybe started during the pandemic. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It's a fictional conversation between Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer here in Seattle, more famously known as. So first, welcome to the show, Beau.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for taking some time. This is an intriguing topic, two intriguing people, both with Washington State ties.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how you got the idea to put these two people in a fictional room together and have them have this fictional conversation.
Sure. So I am not a visual director. I did a student film. I studied film a little bit, but I do not have the camera in my head thing that I think a lot of filmmakers have. There is a single visual that is part of where this idea came from, and that is one of the parts of the genesis, and I will come back to that. But the intersection of the ideas where this script came from is I have always been interested in crime and murder and mayhem for various reasons. But Gary himself is an anomaly or a paradox, depending on how you look at or study profiling, as it is considered. He was arrested on the job that he had had for 20 years. So he was not a drifter. He had been married. He'd had a kid. He'd genuinely stopped murdering people for more than a decade. And all of these things are things that serial killers are not supposed to be able to do. They're supposed to be like an addict. They're not supposed to be in control of their compulsion. So his singularity as a serial killer was interesting to me, having read about the case before he was arrested. And then when I found out that Gary and Ted both lived in Seattle at the same time, for a very small window, but they both lived in the greater Seattle area, somehow that gelled into the idea of them meeting and Ted mentoring Gary. That several of the things that Gary did to get away with his crimes for as long as he did, I give credit for those ideas to Ted, suggesting this is how you don't get caught. And the irony or the hypocrisy in these encounters is the more you know about Ted, the more you know that he doesn't follow any of the advice that he gives Gary, which is why he got caught. He is this arrogant know-it-all figure and dispenses this wisdom that helps Gary, but Ted doesn't bother to follow his own advice. And so the more you know about how he gets busted, he walks off camera or off stage and is going to get arrested and get into trouble very soon.
It is interesting because there's been a lot more focus on Ted Bundy lately, and a lot more, true crime episodes about him. I haven't seen as many about Gary Ridgway.
Gary's never. Some of it is being photogenic, but some of it is Ted was arrested immediately following some of the things that he did, whereas Gary was he was the Green River murderer for more than 10 years because he didn't get caught. So he's not nearly as strongly associated with the things that he did and never became a celebrity villain the way that Ted did.
That's true. And when you see a picture of him, the picture doesn't necessarily line up with what you think of when you think of a serial killer. I mean, you think of Ted Bundy, you think of his self-confident, I'm better than the law, I'm above this. You see a lot of that out of Brian Kohberger, who killed those the co-eds in Idaho. I guess a couple of years ago now,
and ostensibly mostly just to see if he could, or to prove that he could.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if that's part of it. Is that image?
The script explores that without addressing it. I guess is one of the things that comes that came out of the process of writing this that is going to be more about the choices in directing rather than how I chose to write it is an element of class warfare, especially in the era of the mid-70s that they're in. Is Gary is committedly blue collar. He worked painting trucks. He came out of the Navy. And Ted was always a social climber, as people have all of these kind of high-end associations with him, but he never actually achieved anything. He always talked a big game, but he never finished law school. He never did any of the things that he claimed he had in the works or that he did. And he was a fairly banal, like, con man and thief, which is how he appeared to be successful, is he stole clothes and stole sports equipment so that he could live the lifestyle that he thought he should have and he thought people expected of him. So it's another level of the do as I say, not as I do hypocrisy that he looks down on Gary when they come from a very similar background. It's just Gary has accepted it and Ted won't.
Right. And I should say Brian Koberger accused of killing the co-ed. So, that's another question I raised, because you mentioned they're in Seattle at the same time. Is it just my perception, or does Washington State seem to have a tie to a lot of these serial killers?
So, Ted did at least half of his killing elsewhere, but he started here, and most notably started by killing UW students and a few other things that were really very visible. He was never prosecuted for any of the crimes that he committed here, because the later crimes that he committed were so visible they were happy to give him the death penalty for those and leave it at that. Mm-hmm. There have been articles and books and like actual papers written about why this seems to be the case, because it stretches up into BC as well. Like, they seem to have a higher rate kind of per capita, and certainly it may be because it's just the biggest population center, like, in this big part of the country for like 1,000 miles in every direction. There is a fascinating theory or form of study that says that the lead in gasoline may have impacted some people's sanity. And so the more you drove, the more maybe less sane you were. And serial killers tend to be people who drive around a lot or explore a lot. And Ted and Gary both certainly did. So in a place like this that is commuter based, as opposed to somewhere on the East Coast where you didn't drive everywhere, you know, there is a theory that has something to do with it. But there's also theories of the isolation or the accessibility of the woods that the not cheek by jowl lifestyle of New York or Boston, where like your neighbors know you enough to know if you've done something sketchy, that people grow up with a frontier mentality where you leave people alone and you have enough space to get up to something without anyone being too suspicious. I suspect it's a confluence of a lot of different factors, but growing up here, that was certainly kind of part of where all of this came from in terms of my life experiences. Gary was a boogeyman when I was a kid, and Bundy kind of loomed over Seattle long after he left. I remember listening to Ted being interviewed in the week before he was put to death, which would have been in 88, I think, and was like a very substantial early memory for me, which is probably one reason why I wind up coming back to material like this.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about the content of the play.
Sure.
Now, obviously, we're talking about some topics that are not lighthearted.
No.
But so, what do you say to people who might want to stay away from it because they might think it might be graphic or might have some things that might be something they want to stay away from for that reason?
So it is very straightforward. Like, we are not trying to do, this is going to be an immersive show, but we're not doing something sneaky with it. There aren't going to be any reveals. There's nothing shocking about this. No one's going to attempt to scare you. This is just two guys talking. They do talk about some horrific things, but because they're ostensibly in public, like they meet in a bar, nothing of what they say is like explicit, and there's no violence on the stage. Like, you will understand what they're talking about, and you will have an emotional response to it, but we are not being in your face about it. And there's almost nothing conversationally that you would consider graphic. It's all like one layer of implication, because you can't say, yes, I murdered someone in a bar in front of people. And the audience for the show is ostensibly going to be potential witnesses in this bar while this conversation is happening. So it is definitely like R-rated in terms of language and content, but it is not explicit in any way, and there's no violence.
No reenactments off to the side or anything like that. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it makes it more intellectual, which I think it probably makes it, to me, something that's more enjoyable, something to think about more than, immerse yourself in a bloody mess of bodies.
Yeah, it's a really specific target to try to make something that is visceral without being explicit. But one of the things that I wanted to do was try to do this without irony or without winking and without being prurient for the sake of itself. This is not trying to be horror. It's not trying to be like a B movie. It's not trying to be titillating. It's trying to be an experience of who these people really might have been at that time.
Are you looking at this from the perspective of there's this growing trend in film and in media circles to lift up the villain to more be an anti-hero, so that you look at a lot of these, even Darth Vader, right, has a redemption, story. A lot of these villains have these, redemption stories that give them a background to make them seem less like, when we were growing up, it was good and evil, and have you taken a tack like that, or is it just straight matter of fact and the audience can, make up their own minds?
That's a great question. And in terms of thinking about this kind of topic and how I've approached this, I somewhere between Silence of the Lambs and this present era of Dexter and You and My Favorite Murder, and at least partly because of what you're talking about, I think we have lost track a little bit of just how bad some of these people are or can be, because we've made them interesting, or we've made them appealing, or we've made them anti-heroes. There is not a lot of arc for Ted in this play at all. The arc of the show is Gary kind of developing into the person that he becomes as we know him as the Green River Murderer. But it was important to me to not say, I want these people to be sympathetic. I want these people, I show them as multidimensional people. I want them to be humans. I don't want our perspective of them to be humane.
Right.
Neither of them make an excuse for this is why the way that I am. They have a fairly blunt discussion of like, we don't know anyone else like this, so we're going to take advantage of being able to talk to someone who gets where I'm coming from in a way that no one else does. So it's like running into someone who is a nerd about something very, very specific that you're like, oh, I didn't know anyone else was into this. So them kind of talking shop in veiled terms because they can't be explicit means you have to pay attention. It certainly means that the more that you know about either of them, the more you will be able to take away and say like, oh, I get that they're talking about this specific thing. But in writing this, it was never my goal for them to be sympathetic. You can certainly look at either of their lives and make some excuses for their behavior or understand or justify. And there are people who were interested in doing that. And in another format, I have done that, but that is not what this play is for.
Okay. So why don't you, you've been working on this since the pandemic, or did you start it during COVID?
That's a great question. I think I started it in 2020. I wrote like half of it, and it made me uncomfortable enough that I had to take some time away from it. And that has been the case throughout this process, is I learned something that is distasteful enough that I have to take a week off. Just the other day doing a draft of this, I got to the end of going through corrections, and I was like, wow, I'm really gross. I sat down and made an effort to make them sound less human. And I don't mean like less like people. I mean like detached from the, they objectify the people that they are harming, because people like this don't view other people as people. The first, like the vision that this came from, and I mean that specifically because it was a picture in my head and I don't get this often, is if you made a movie of this, this is how it would open, is there is a woman standing at a bus stop, and you can hear someone breathing, and you realize that the camera perspective is someone watching this woman. And the camera pulls back, and it's over the shoulder of someone who is sitting in a truck, smoking, watching this woman, and you hear the breathing, so you assume it's the guy who's watching her. And then the camera pulls back again, and there is someone standing in the shadows watching the guy who's watching the woman. So Gary is out perving. He hasn't become a murderer yet, so he just likes to watch people. And unbeknownst to him, Ted is watching him and realizing that he watches people the way that Ted does. And so instead of identifying a target, he says, here is someone like me. I need to meet this person. And socially engineers a situation where he like bumps into Gary so he can make him talk to him. And then the conversation grows from there. And it's 3 scenes over 3 different days that take place over like a week. And it starts as, if you don't talk to me, I will tell people that I know that you're a pervert. And it ends with them kind of trying to almost one-up each other, or certainly them being on the same page. Mm-hmm. So there is, I do not want this to be a conspiracy theory, but there is a slight implication that by the end of the show, that if Gary had never met Ted, he might have never fallen over the edge. He just might have been a little bit weird his whole life instead of actually choosing to cross the line of becoming a murderer.
Yeah. Interesting. So I know you've done a few read-throughs of it.
Yes.
What are the plans for you that you can announce as far as getting this on stage?
We did a table read of it at the venue where the show is going to be, which is the Jules Mays Saloon in Georgetown. The play is going to be in October. The last read through was in November. I have a proof copy of the script right here that I've been dragging around for a couple of weeks and redlining. So I did, the timing of this is really auspicious because I did script lock yesterday. I finished the margins and sent it back to Amazon to get it printed, to have a script that I can hand off to the actors. And that is, we'll tinker with it in the room, but that's 99% done. And I would have said it was 90 to 95% done back in November where we did the table read. And a year before that, during was the pandemic, so it was still a Zoom reading, we did a table read of like a half an hour of it just to get it in front of some people. And I, especially if it's going to be heard by lots of people, I want to make sure that I get to hear it a lot of times rather than reading it to myself. I find reading it aloud helps, but at some point you have to ask someone else to do it to make sure that your words make sense coming out of someone else's mouth.
Yeah, and I imagine you want to sit back from it so that you can feel the impact of it rather than you being the person reading it. Something that I haven't done before, but that I did in November that I found really valuable is I recorded them reading it. So like I can put it on and listen to them reading while I'm driving. So it has a slightly different context and I'm just listening rather than looking at the actor or making notes while they do it. So the lines hit a little bit different and I can say like, oh, that sounds not the way I intended. I can adjust it. And it's almost never like that sounds wrong. It is, this can sound better or this can be more effective. Has it been consistent from the beginning, that the changes that you've made have just been small ones, or have you had to make like a 90-degree turn at some point during the creative process?
There was a point where that could have happened. Because like I said, I had to step away at one point and take some space. And that may have been almost 6 months later when I came back and finished it. And I finished it in a day or two. Like, I wrote this in a couple of big binges. And it's 75 minutes if there's no blocking. So it'll feel like movie length by the time we're actually doing it. So it's not long. But I wrote the first 2 scenes more or less and then wasn't actually sure how it would end. And part of my process is I look at it like in the back of my brain, there is the puzzle of what I want it to be at the end of the day. And when I'm walking or driving or doing other things, a small part of my brain is just like sifting through the pieces and things fall into place, or I go like, aha, here's a corner. And then, the next day I have to sit down and type it out because it finally kind of told me what's going to happen. Yeah. So the window where I stepped away was where the third act kind of came together, and I decided that there had to be, or I figured out that there had to be some kind of escalation. I didn't want it to have like a really iron conclusion, but Ted has to leave town when the play is over. They don't say that explicitly, but it was when his face first appeared in a paper and someone named Teddy was stalking co-eds, and so he left town. And he left town because he knew that they were breathing down his neck. And that happens off camera, but I want there to be kind of hints of the escalation that is going to get him in trouble.
Okay.
The end of the scene of the last one ends with them parting and saying, we're never going to see each other again because it's too dangerous. But the people who know will know that that's also because Ted is going to get the hell out of town. But Gary also says that in the time in between, he has stepped up to take his first life. And historically, that's probably not accurate. That's part of the fiction. But the escalation of someone like him becoming a killer has to happen at some point. So choosing to have this play kind of show the inspiration or the instigating moment for that to happen is I think what I figured out when I took the time apart.
Yeah, I always wonder, and another question for you as the creator is, how do you know when it's done? Or is it ever done? I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, even the reviews that I write, at some point I get to the point where it's just, I don't know what else I can add to this that's going to provide any value, but I still don't know that it's the best writing that it could be.
The internet makes that dangerous. I remember decades ago now, Stephen King saying that the Kindle was a threat to him, not because of publishing things, but because he will be tempted to go back and fix something that has always bothered him that he didn't get to fix when it went to print. So writers, lots of writers, myself included, are inherently like tinkerers. So there's always the danger to go back and be like, oh, I can make it better.
Yeah.
And we may do another version of this after I hear the actors who were cast do the lines. And this may change a little bit. And I will have to make a choice as to whether I change that for that actor or whether I change that for future actors. Whether it's just because this guy has struggles with saying this sentence or whether the actor came up with a better sentence. I chose to think that this was done because I needed a 3-act structure. I was happy with like the length of it. So then it was a tinkering phase of making everything better. And I can't say I don't believe in perfection, but I think in theater, the pursuit of perfection is dangerous because you can tinker yourself into the ground because at some point the audience shows up. So at some point you have to say this is as good as it's going to get today or this week or ever. It doesn't matter. So at some point, rather than saying this is perfect, I say this is ready for me to hand off to actors.
Yeah.
That it is saying what I set out for it to say, or that I've heard it read several times and don't want to fix lots of things. The first draft is done when you have a beginning, middle, and an end. And even then, writing is not always that convenient. But writing a play, and especially a play in kind of a limited format with just 2 people, helps keep it contained. So I don't want to keep it going. And it having a historical endpoint and Ted being smart enough to say that two people like us can't keep being seen together in public, or one of us will get in trouble. A line that I'm happy with, that I remember listening to while I was driving around and coming back and fixing, is Ted says, if you see one hornet, you kill it. If you see two, you call an exterminator. So we cannot be hanging out, or someone will be like, hey, what are these two guys up to? Yeah. Especially because they have nothing in common otherwise. I did not set out to make them an odd couple, but especially in the process of writing, when it's just two people, you have to make sure they sound like different people. When there's only two voices, they can't be the same voice. Some writers, everyone Aaron Sorkin writes sounds smart. They don't sound like the same smart person, but they all sound smart. And so I had to go back and make specific choices to make Gary sound like he's from a different place than Ted. Gary uses contractions. Ted uses less of them because he wants people to think that he's an intellectual. So having a draft where I go back and just do little things like that means I'm close to done. And when I'm done with that is probably when I should choose to be done, because otherwise I will tinker it to death. And having a deadline of at some point we have actors and at some point we have an audience means you have to be like, okay, that's locked. We're going to stop changing things.
Yeah. So the plays are going to be staged in November. October. So we're going to have you back on for a behind the curtain to talk about the staging of the play.
Oh, absolutely. That would be fantastic.
Since you'll be directing it as well, right?
Right now, yes. Right now, you can go to tedandgary.com and sign up for the mailing list. It's just a landing page right now. It'll be at the Jules Mays Saloon in October. We will launch ticket sales a couple of months before that, but between now and then, we will start uploading interviews like this and interviews with the actors and behind-the-scenes stuff about Ted and Gary between now and then. This is going to be an immersive event. There's not going to be a huge audience, so you will get to feel like you were in the room eavesdropping with these two guys. And yeah, there's a whole extra layer of stuff to talk about with me writing something with the intent of directing it, because I found myself skipping subtext that if I handed the script to someone else and said, go direct it, I would have made a lot more things explicit with this is why he's saying that, or this is what he's referring to.
My guest has been Beau Prichard, writer of a new play called Ted and Gary, about a fictional conversation between serial killers Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. You can keep an eye out on our webpage and our social media, as well as tedandgary.com, which is the official website of the play, to find out more information about the play as we get closer to October, when he's going to be staging it. And stay tuned for part 2 of our interview with Beau as we get closer to the time when he's going to be on stage with the play, to talk about his experience directing it and how the play is coming along in that regard. So once again, Beau Prichard, I thank him for joining me today, and I can't wait to show you part 2 of our interview with him to talk about his direction of his play, Ted and Gary. And once again, I'm Greg Hyland with The Sound on Stage. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Between the Pages. And until next time, I will see you at the stage door.